Good afternoon and welcome to the next concurrent session of the day, the local impact of teaching voting theory. Our presenters today are John Anderson and Max Eschbacher. John Anderson is an associate professor at Utah Valley University who teaches developmental mathematics with a focus on quantitative reasoning. Max Eschbacher is an associate professor of developmental mathematics at Utah Valley University, whose research interests include math education policy, voting theory education, and business education. He is currently pursuing an MBA from the University of Utah. If you have any questions for the presenters during the session, please feel free to enter those into the Q&A section at the bottom of the Zoom room screen, and we will address them at the end of the talk. And on that note, I will hand it over to our presenters.
Great, thank you. Again, my name is John Anderson, and Max and I have been teaching quantitative literacy for quite some time now in a quantitative reasoning course. And I'm going to go ahead and share my screen so that we can go ahead and present. So just wanted to start with a little bit of background about ourselves. We teach at Utah Valley University, which is classified as a regional state university. It happens to double as the community college in our area, as well as being our four-year degree program. So we have a lot of bachelor's programs. We have quite a few associates, some certificates, as well as we have some grad programs as well, particularly in computer science and some of the areas around there. Our count last fall was in 2021, we had just over 41,000 students. And for Max and I teaching here at this Valley, we received a $10,000 grant for leadership and civic thought to develop voting theory curriculum for our students here at our school and across the curriculum here. And so this is one of our first chances to look at some of this, to explore this, and look at it, particularly at the voting theory and some of the things related to it at the level of for this grant and trying to help educate our students here in Utah. Max, did you want to add anything?
No, let's keep going.
Okay. So to get started, we really want to start with an example that's happened recently to just kind of get the idea across of what we're looking at and to bring in local examples to be able to show our students. And in that way, we're much better able to make them aware of what's going on and to buy into what we're teaching, because it's things that are directly impacting them. And so back in 2020, getting ready for that election, the Utah gubernatorial election, the Republican primary met. And at the time, they ended up with 7 candidates that were all vying to be the Republican candidate in the public square, to be on the ballot. And we'll get into the details of this later. But with 7 candidates, it's really hard to find a majority, someone who everyone wants to rally behind. And that's precisely what happened. The lead candidate only had 30.2% of the support in the primary. The other 70% was split between the other candidates. And so it's really difficult then to select that person if only 30% have them as their pick. You could run into situations where maybe that candidate is liked by his core, but not liked by everyone else. And so the question becomes, what do you do? How do you resolve this? And how do you be able to move on and find someone that people will be comfortable with to say, yes, I helped pick and select that elected official for us. And so this happened before in Utah back in 2004, but we want to focus on 2020. And I also, before moving on, just want to specifically mention that when we talked about ranked choice voting, this is a process of the voters saying, I'm selecting these as my top 5, top 7. You could rank everybody, you could rank some number of them, but you list them in order. Who's my preferred vote? Who's my second choice? Who's my third choice? Who's my fourth choice? And there's several different voting methods that get used, but when you see ranked choice voting used by the media, it primarily is referring to what is also known as instant runoff or plurality with elimination, where what you're doing is you're simulating a runoff election, assuming that people won't change their votes in between runoff elections, And so you just fill out your ballot once, and then that ballot gets used to calculate who the winner is. So whenever you see ranked choice voting, be aware we're using it in this context the same way the media does, in the sense that this is an instant runoff that uses ranked choice ballots to calculate a winner. And we'll get into some of the details later, but just also tying this into what is happening in Utah. About 3-4 years ago, the House passed a bill that allowed any cities, any municipalities to use ranked choice voting to actually determine who their winner was. And so if you had more than 2 candidates, you could select which ones in order that you wanted, and then those would be used to calculate it. And you can see that as of this past year, as of the 2021 election, 23 cities in Utah have now chosen to use ranked choice voting to select their mayors, their commissioners, and their different elected roles in their cities. And so we just wanted to give some background for what's happening here. Max?
Yeah, so I'll break in and say, back up to the previous slide. So a big part of the motivation that drives this, I think John and I both started teaching voting theory just as a labor of passion. Like, we were interested in it. We thought our students might be interested in it. And then the 2016 presidential election came along, and there was some interesting implications there, especially in the Republican primary. And then I just sort of started to think, maybe this is really important, because plurality is the method that gets used almost everywhere. And in large fields, it kind of does a really poor job of reflecting the will of the voters. And this is starting to become more prevalent in municipalities all across the country. You see it in the Utah map here, but take a look at your own state and just do a search for ranked choice voting, and you can see what's going on there too. I think there's curriculum that could appeal to students locally anywhere in the US. And the story I tell my students about ranked choice voting, the media always says ranked choice voting when they mean instant runoff. But I think that's kind of the equivalent of going to a steakhouse and the server comes up and says, "What kind of steak do you want?" And you say meat. I mean, ranked choice voting is the umbrella term. The various methods that we'll talk about, instant runoff, board account, and so on and so forth, we'll get to those, but those are the more specific ranked choice methods.
You want to talk about what ranked choice voting is, what instant runoff is then?
Yeah, so we'll do a brief rundown of that. Every voter ranks the candidates in the order they prefer them. Just like John said, first choice, second choice, third choice. And then you do a quick count and you say, who got the fewest first place votes? Whoever that candidate is, they're out. We eliminate them from the rankings. And wherever they happen to appear on any given ballot, their vote is removed and all the votes shift up a slot. And then you just continue to repeat that process until you have a candidate that has a majority of first place votes.
And it should be pointed out that at any given time, if you have a majority of first place votes, they're instantly selected. So that's the first step, is to see, does anyone have more than 50% of the votes? And if they do, you're done. If they're not, then you look to see, to remove the person with the fewest first place and move forward from there. And so in this way, you're allowed to look at that preference, and you use that preference to try and represent what the people want. Well, if I didn't get my first place votes, who would my second be? And again, you may have heard of runoff elections where you have to repeatedly go back and recast ballots and revote until you narrow it down to a winner. The entire point of this, and why it's called instant runoff, is it removes that need to go back and revote. You only vote once, and then it's just used however many times it needs. And so it saves time and money and energy in trying to regather votes. There can be voter fatigue that can happen if you run several rounds, for instance. And so
that's one of the biggest advantages, I think.
Yeah.
Removing the burden on the voters on top of all the money you save. There's just really no reason to do runoff elections when you can do instant runoff instead.
And so that's what we're going to do. And we're going to go back to the 2020 gubernatorial election. where again, we had 7 candidates. And so here you can see that there's 6 rounds before a winner was selected. This one ended up showing the entirety of it. So in the first round, you can see that all the candidates, all of their running mates, and at the bottom, you see this inactive ballots, but this is used because if someone chooses to only put a few people on their list and all of their people are eliminated, their ballot no longer counts towards the whole because they don't have any preference on who's left.
Can we
so
back
that's
up
what
a
this
second, John?
bottom rows. Yep.
I always got confused when I first looked at this example because the way the laws are written in Utah, you have a public primary where anyone can vote. And if you don't get, what did they say, 60% of the vote? So
Yep.
if no one candidate gets 60% of the vote in that election, then you hold an instant runoff election at the caucus. So the reason these numbers look so small for a statewide election is that this is just happening at the caucus. This is not happening across the state.
Yeah, this isn't the state vote. This is just selecting who will be the representative of the Republican Party in the governor election. So this isn't all of the candidates. We're only using this within the primary to select it. And it's the caucus following the primary since no one had enough vote.
Yeah, and as it happens, this is the Republican primary, and Utah is a notoriously red state. So this might as well be the general election. Whoever wins this primary is almost a shoo-in to win the general.
It's been since the early 1990s that we've not had a Republican. So it's been a long time. And so you can see here that no one has more than 50% of the vote. And so we look at the person with the fewest first place votes, Christensen Chamberlain pairing at 44, and we remove them from the ballots. And so when we do this, it turns out that 2 people, they only put Christensen on, that's it. So their votes are now, their ballot's now done. They don't have a second choice. But you can see that 17 people had selected Birmingham as their second choice. 5 had selected Wright. 8 had selected Newton. 11 had selected Hughes, and 1 had selected Cox. So of the 44 votes, we split them according to the individual voter's second choice and add these so that this right here, Birmingham's now up 17 votes from where he was before. So we recalculate the percentages. And you can see a little bit of shifting. 44 is not a whole lot of votes, but you see some shifting. And again, no one rose above 50%. So we do the same thing. We look at the bottom candidate with the fewest first place votes remaining. We eliminate him, and Huntsman's votes now split over to the respective places. To who, if they had Huntsman first or a potentially second, they didn't in this case. But we look at their next choice and we redistribute the votes accordingly. And so now we're starting to watch the percentages grow a little bit more. We're starting to see that Cox is up to 34.3, Hughes has grown to 20.2. Still no one has 50%. So we again take the bottom 530 votes from Birmingham and we redistribute those. And you can see that some people are now out because all the people they've voted for are off the ballot. So we're now up to 30 total ballots that are no longer being counted. And you can see the percentages grow. No one's at 50% still. So we need to take our bottom person again, Wright, Bishop. We take their 658, we redistribute those. And Cox is getting closer. Hughes is doing okay, but we're now looking at Newton with the fewest votes. And so when we redistribute Newton's votes, his 918 votes now split in such a way that Cox ends with 55% of the votes in the Republican primary. And because he now has more than 50%, he is the Republican candidate for the general election that will happen in November. And to point this out, again, Max made mention of this, but the original primary happened in early March. The runoff happened in June. Once they realized that no one had enough votes, they ran this caucus in June and used instant runoff. So all the people only voted once and they just worked through their ballots until someone had more than 50% of the vote. And this just happened in our most recent election. So for our students, this is really close to home. For some of our students, this is the first time they may have voted in a gubernatorial election. And so it really helps bring it closer to home when you can talk about what's happening in your home state and show how these processes are being used.
And for what it's worth, this is somewhat of a success story. Politics and personal preferences notwithstanding, it turns out that Cox was the person who had the plurality in the original election. And so this instant runoff caucus vote simply verified that the will of the caucus sort of lined up with the plurality of the general population. That certainly doesn't have to be the case. Like John mentioned, John, can you go back to like the very first slide? Sorry to hassle you with it. I like the visual.
This
where you
one?
have 7 or 8
Or-
candidates all lined up. Yeah, that one. So if that candidate that's highlighted in white there gets the plurality of votes, and that plurality is only 30%, it's possible that 70% of the voting population absolutely hates that person. And that's really kind of the driving force behind all of these methods. You sort of distill the preferences down one step at a time until you figure out that, oh yeah, indeed, we have in some sense, a majority of people who can live with this candidate as the winner. Okay, thanks. We can go back to where we were. Okay, so in 1950, an economist named Kenneth Arrow wrote as his dissertation a paper about social welfare and voting theory that outlined a beautiful yet troubling result, which was that if you outline a number of fairness criteria, and when I teach this to my students, I have to have a serious talk about the word fairness, because I mean, in some sense, all elections are fair and that the rules are applied uniformly across the voting population. But when we say fairness here, we really mean justice. We mean, when we say fairness criteria, we're saying, how do we measure whether an election does a good job of capturing the will of the voters? In particular, and I'll just run down these quickly, the majority criterion says, if there's a majority candidate, that candidate should win. And not every election method guarantees that. The Condorcet criterion is a little more complicated, but it says if you match the candidates up pairwise head to head, if one candidate wins all those pairwise matchups, then that candidate should be the winner. Again, not guaranteed by every election system. Monotonicity says that a candidate should not be harmed by moving up on a ballot. The independence of irrelevant alternatives is one of the most controversial. It particularly comes into play when a candidate has to drop out of an election. And we see this for a number of reasons. It may come to light that a candidate was ineligible to run and they have to drop out after they've already gotten some votes. Presidential primaries see candidates dropping out along the way as part of the process. But the independent of irrelevant alternatives criterion says when this happens, when a candidate drops out of the race, that shouldn't change who the winner would have been. In other words, the winner of an election should still win, even if a different candidate who didn't win drops out. And we mentioned the dictator criterion here, even though it's pretty obvious that this essentially says you can't have one vote determining the outcome of the election. There can't be a dictator. That's definitely not fair or just. So the result of Arrow's impossibility theorem is that if you outline these fairness criteria, Arrow managed to prove that not only do we not have a voting system that satisfies all of them, we cannot have a voting system that satisfies all of them. It's impossible. That's why it's the impossibility theorem. So we experience this brief moment of despair in that it's impossible to have an election system that's perfectly fair. And then out of this despair grows hope, because we realize, hey, we can look closely at these fairness criteria, figure out which ones are important to us, and then aim our election system at satisfying the ones that we really, really care about. All right, let's move on. Okay, so we've got ranked choice, and remember here, we use the convention that ranked choice, as we refer to it here, means instant runoff, will never violate the majority criterion. And the reason it will never violate the majority criterion is because the first thing you do is check for a majority candidate. And if you have one, that candidate wins. But Condorcet, monotonicity, irrelevant alternatives, those are still on the table. Those could all be violated by the ranked choice voting instant runoff method.
Although it is important to point out that just because it can be violated doesn't mean that it will be in any given election. But there are things about the method that allow these to be violated.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Important to keep in mind that just because something could happen here doesn't mean it will all that often or really ever in practice.
And again, this is just to make sure that the students are aware of the conversation, so that as we start talking about things and they start running into situations where they might want to hold elections, they can have the idea of fairness in mind in selecting the method that they want. Now, at this point, it's important to point out that we keep mentioning that ranked choice voting is an umbrella term. So it's important to recognize that there's other methods out there that might work. The most common one is simply the plurality method. And the entire point behind the plurality method is whoever has the most votes wins. The problem is that as soon as you have more than 2 candidates, that means you may be picking someone that only has a smaller portion. We mentioned before with 7 candidates, Spencer Cox, who happened to win through the primary all the way through with the instant runoff, he only had 30.2% of the vote. And so it could have been that everyone else was opposed to him, but because they split their votes, it caused this issue where he might have won with only 30.2. And so he doesn't have a majority of voters behind him. He isn't really expressing the will of what the people wanted, and yet he was selected. So plurality is what has typically been done historically across the board. This is where most voting systems started.
Indeed, a race with just 3 candidates can have a plurality with 33.34% of the vote. Way less than majority.
If they're all otherwise equal, one of them will just edge off just a little bit.
Yeah.
The next method is board account, and it's named after the person who helped establish it and drove it. But the entire point is that you rank your people according to your choice, first, second, third, fourth, and then you give points to them such that the first place vote gets the most points, second place vote generates a few less points, third place, fourth place, and so on for however many you're doing. You assign points, you then add them together, and whoever has the most points ends up winning the election. And in practice, this one seems like it would be a really good one. It seems to be very fair in terms of what people think of in terms of fairness. You're giving points based on how you feel about them. But one of the big problems with board account is that it can actually, this is the one that is most likely to violate the majority criteria. It could be that a majority of people want a particular person as their first or second choice or third choice, but despite that, someone else gets the rest of the first place votes and a lot of second place votes and ends up beating them out in terms of raw points, because they end up across all the ballots being just a little bit higher across the board, even though a majority picked the other person first.
I will say that students love board account.
Mm-hmm.
The notion of assigning point values to rankings seems really intuitive, and even those calculations turn out to be kind of fun.
Yeah.
I'll just throw in an extra plug. When you teach voting theory in practice, do it in Excel, and especially with board account. It's just so much easier and cleaner to do this in a spreadsheet rather than writing numbers and doing all these calculations one by hand. I've done it both ways, and the winner is clear here.
Yeah, board account definitely lends itself well to Excel. The other methods can, but they get a little bit trickier. But even being able to track them in Excel can be useful.
Mm-hmm.
The main advantage the board account does have is that it tends to find the compromise candidate, not the one that everyone wants, but the one that everyone will live with.
Yeah, this board account aims at the candidate that is least hated.
Right.
Even if it misses the candidate who had a majority of people who love them.
And so that there are plenty of places where board account seems to be used quite well. Pairwise comparisons actually goes back to the Condorcet criterion, where you take everybody, think of it as a round robin tournament, where you take every candidate, you pair them against every other candidate, and you look across all the ballots, and you're trying to see, is there someone that everyone picked in every head-to-head? So if candidate
In a
A
majority
versus,
of head-to-heads.
what's that?
Oh, sorry. Yeah, I see what you mean. In every head-to-head, yes.
In every head-to-head comparison. So candidate A versus B, A versus C, A versus D. And if A beats B, C, and D, then A is going to win because he won the most individual head-to-head elections. So if you had the opportunity to do this in the real world, imagine having to vote, 10 times to make the comparison between 4 candidates. And the entire point of this is by using the preference, you can do that in one vote instead. The downside to pairwise comparison is it's one of the hardest to calculate. It takes the most time and energy to work through all of the calculations. And the more candidates you have, the larger those number of comparisons grows.
Well, let's be clear. The ease of doing this is not really different in practice because all of this would be done by a computer.
Absolutely.
However, transparency in the eyes of the voters is important. And while things like plurality and even board account are easy for voters to understand, pairwise comparisons, not necessarily. So even though there's a great paper I read recently arguing that pairwise comparison was the best method, I think it has a serious problem with voter education. You would really need to do a lot of work to get voters on board with it.
Well, because even instant runoff makes sense. It's just replicating what we would do if we didn't do it instantly. We just keep running runoff elections over and over again, and this is a way to shortcut that.
Yeah.
But pairwise comparison is the one that it's harder to wrap your mind around. It is harder if you have to hand calculate it. It's one of the hardest ones to do. Even for computer programs, it's one of the more difficult ones to code for sure. But once it's coded for, it'll work every time. And these are the ones that most textbooks like the Denley Hall, these are the ones that they talk about. But it's worth pointing out that there's a few others. So I'm going to let Max talk about the next 2 methods of voting.
Okay, so approval voting is intuitively very clean. You get a list of candidates and you just put a checkbox next to everyone who you could accept, every candidate for whom you approve. It has a big problem in that it sort of de facto fails the majority criterion because a majority of votes now is no longer unique. Imagine the extreme case where every voter voted for every candidate. Now every candidate is getting 100% of the vote. It can be hard to determine a winner in that scenario. However, approval voting could be used for a variety of non-political elections. Think of something like a school board, where you've got lots of people running for these sort of fungible, interchangeable positions. A student body government even is a possibility here, but say you have 10 candidates for 3 open positions, and those 3 open positions are essentially the same. And you can just sort of slot any candidate into any position. Now approval voting has a lot of merit because we're just trying to figure out who do people approve of the most, and how do we get 3 people in there. And cumulative. So we'll talk about this a little bit later in stretch topics, because this voting system does not compare directly to the others, but it has something in common with approval voting, in that it was recommended by a professor from Harvard who recently passed away, who passionately opposed gerrymandering.
Voting or technical questions.
Oh.
Most likely,
Sorry.
the way that this will work is that they'll send you a link to an online code editor, hopefully not a Google Doc, and it will probably either be HackerRank, Code.
So
They're all basically
We need
the
to
same,
figure out how to mute.
but some of them have like also online whiteboarding features, so that's pretty useful. And at the end, hopefully your interviewer will leave.
Was that me? Did I do that?
it did sound like it was you. As soon as you muted yourself, it stopped.
Okay, well, I think I just hit a button on my keyboard that did something weird. Where was I? Cumulative voting. Okay, yeah, so let's use Utah as an example. Utah has 4 Congress people. Instead of dividing the state up into districts and having the people from each district vote for their congressperson, leaving the door open for gerrymandering. You take every candidate who's running, and with 4 open slots, you just give every voter 4 votes, and they can give those votes to whoever they want. So I could give all 4 of my votes to one candidate that's going to serve me. I could split them up 2 and 2. I could split them up 3 and 1, or I could give 1 vote to each of 4 different candidates if I really wanted to do that. And you can still have the districts divided, but now when everyone in the state is voting for all the representatives, it takes away a lot of the implications of gerrymandering, which has a lot of appeal.
And to be clear, the winners would be the people with the top 4 vote counts.
Yeah. So it would function like approval voting in that way, that you just count up how many votes each person got, and whoever got the most would win, and then you keep going down the list until you've got enough candidates.
And it's slightly different than approval because it limits the amount of votes you get to how many representatives you want.
Yeah.
So moving into the stretch topics, these are other topics that you may be interested in tying into your voting theory. These are other things that have a direct impact on politics and how math can play into them. And so even though they're related, there's still some differences, but apportionment is actually the taking a representative body and figuring out how to split it up fairly. And so the big example is the US Congress has 438 congressmen, and you need to divide them up over the 50 states. That's supposed to be done by population. Apportionment is the math that is done to ensure that every state gets a proportional amount of seats in that body, while still allowing for not splitting of seats. Every seat belongs to just one state, making sure it's fair in the way that it's split up. And then that then leads to, within a state, a conversation about gerrymandering. So you can see here, these are the 4 districts in Utah. And I just want you to take just a minute and look at those and think for yourself if you think that this looks like it might have some gerrymandering implications to it. Just the shape of the different districts can be very telling.
So I'll point it out here. The orange region in particular, so this is the region that sort of extends to the bottom left, the bottom west corner of the state. It has this little chunk right here at the top that sort of encompasses most of Salt Lake City all the way over to the east bench of Salt Lake City. So you've got these large swaths of rural territory in the middle of the state, heading all the way south, and you're combining that with this really densely packed metropolitan area up at the top. And the sort of stated goal, or one of the stated guiding goals, is to have districts sized so that they are all of the same rough population total. So we've got this. So the argument, I think, is you combine the densely populated part of the city with some of the more rural, more sparsely populated parts of the state, and you get a region that has a fair population total. The problem is the needs of those voters living in Salt Lake City might be very different from the needs of people growing alfalfa in the southern part of the state. And I mean, I have my own political theories about why the map was drawn this way. But just recently, Utah underwent an effort to try and redraw the congressional map, and it failed. So this is still what we have. But I think this is a really interesting issue, and I'll add to this. As John said earlier, this talk was born out of a grant that we got to develop some voting curriculum, and we have our own reasons to be passionate about this subject. But I would just say, Honestly, I teach voting theory so I can teach apportionment. The mathematics of apportioning the US Congress is fascinating. It's rigorous, yet it's easy to teach to a population of students who have basically nothing more than simple arithmetic. It helps if they can find their way around a spreadsheet in Excel, but you can kind of teach them how to do that along the way. It's this fascinating notion that the founding fathers wrote into the Constitution, figuring it would be a simple exercise in arithmetic. Oh, we should apportion the Congress according to the populations of the states. Easy. That should be easy to do, but it's rife with problems. And that turns out to be very interesting to teach about.
Yeah, I agree. And again, I just want to echo that it helps to really include the students and teach them how to use spreadsheet software to do this, because there's a lot of repetitive work that needs to be done, and that's what spreadsheets are built for. And then the last topic is the weighted voting systems. In that these are things like boards where the president of a board may have more weight than others. It's an interesting topic. I don't teach this one nearly as often as I do voting theory and apportionment, just usually due to time constraints, but it certainly can be useful even in household dynamics. If you have parents and kids, do you want to consider a weighted voting system where the parents have more weight on the decisions that are made, but it still gives the kids an opportunity to express what they want. So it can be used in many more venues than just a board of a company. And same with the apportionment. You can use this to fairly divide out. If you have a limited number of fleet vehicles and you need to apportion them out to the colleges in your school, there are ways to use apportionment to do that as well. So there's lots of political aspects to these. That's where most of this originated from. But there are applications to these that extend beyond just the political world.
The apportionment of a faculty senate across schools and colleges and departments is another great example that's probably relevant to most of the people watching. I mean, when your department goes from 25 people to 26, do you automatically get another senator on the faculty senate? Does that warrant an additional vote? And if so, what implications does that have for the way the senators are distributed through the rest of the college?
Yeah. Just as we're getting close to being done, we just wanted to point out at a couple of places that our teaching since 2016, when we started teaching this material, and Max very easily convinced me to start teaching voting theory. We've already seen an impact at UVU related to this. So I just want to point out, these are our student body elections. This is for student body president and the different vice presidents over different things. And it was actually, at the time that they implemented this, there are a couple of things that converged at once. We had some people in our institutional research that were really big fans of instant runoff, as well as I had a former student of mine who was involved in instant runoff. And so they changed the student bylaws to use the ranked choice voting, the instant runoff voting. And that happened after that student had taken the class from me and learned about these things. And so I've seen it actually directly impact the way student government goes. You can see right here on the screen that they now use ranked choice voting. They have a brief explanation of it to help explain the process to the students. Max mentioned faculty senate, which is something that at our university here, I'm very involved in. I've had some role in Senate since 2012. And I pushed for us to use ranked choice voting whenever there were more than 2 candidates, to help speed the process along and to make things more fair. And we've seen that happen. And so we're also seeing a growing number of informed voters across the state. When that law passed in 2018 to allow municipalities, there were only 2 cities that took them up on it when it was announced. And we're seeing that start to grow as more and more students and more members of our population are beginning to discover what ranked choice voting, that big umbrella is, what the methods behind it are, why you should do it, and how it can help lead to a better and more accurate, without being perfectly accurate, arrows and possibility theorem, will of the people.
Yeah, the impact is notable, at least in our experience. And this, like I said, it started out as something that I was just kind of excited about. I thought it was cool. But the more I teach it and the more I study it, the more I realize this extends all the way to issues that even go way beyond mathematics. This extends to issues of voter engagement, social justice, civic responsibility, and the list goes on. So these are the arguments that we made to help us get this grant to develop this curriculum. And when we first sat down and started talking about it, we thought, what we really want to do is develop some tools that are going to make it easy for teachers to incorporate this into their classrooms. And so this is one of the places we're going with this, because voting theory examples are really tough to generate. The Hawks book that we use, the Denley Hall book, and there are some others, has some pretty good examples in it, and I've taught effectively from it for a number of years now. But it would be nice to have a way to just push a button and generate a brand new example. And that's what we want to do. So John and I we're gonna take this grant and try to use what limited programming skills we have to write some software that will do this. So say you want an example of a preference schedule that you can run by board account where you will violate the majority criterion. Or you want an example of an instant runoff preference schedule that will violate the independence of irrelevant alternatives, or monotonicity. We want to generate this software where you can maybe have some drop-down menus and then just say generate example, and it'll give you a brand new randomly generated preference schedule that will sort of conform to the parameters that you chose.
All right, so with that, we're at the end of our presentation. Again, being able to engage and talk about this with your students can go a tremendous way into helping them be aware of what's happening. It can make the politics that are often viewed as something that I don't want to participate in as something that I should participate in, that voter engagement, that civic responsibility. We both really feel like this is important enough to teach that we carve out time out of a busy class to ensure that students have the opportunity to engage with and learn this. And we're looking for ways to improve that as well. So at this point, we're welcome. We're open to questions. I know we have a little bit of time left, so we'll turn it back over to Daisy and go from there.
Yeah, so if any of you guys have questions, feel free to throw them in the Q&A box down at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and we'll be happy to field them and get those answered for you. So feel free to type them up and put them in there, and we'll make sure to get them answered.
We will also share this PowerPoint with Daisy in case anyone's curious. And John, can we put our email addresses in there just in case anyone wants to contact us?
Yep.
John made a great template for a spreadsheet that you can use to teach the apportionment of Congress, even to use as a project. I've used that a number of years. We can share that as well. And we haven't written the example generating software yet, but it's sort of next on our list. So that'll be coming along soon. And if you want to keep in touch with us, we can point you to it as soon as it's ready.
Not seeing any questions come in, but that's totally fine. If you have any, I'm sure Max and John would be more than happy. If think of something afterwards, you can email them, and they'd be more than happy to answer them there. I know that there was a lot covered in this, so it's sometimes hard to think of a question right away to ask. So no pressure there.
I'll take it as a compliment that we explained everything.
Yep.
Exactly. Well, if we don't have any questions coming in, no worries. We can end just a minute early here and not too much early. Y'all are right on point. Love that. But it does look like it is time to end here. But thank you both for the valuable information you shared with us today. It was really awesome and something I had not really thought about or heard about in the past. So really, really interesting stuff there. But I am going to go ahead in the chat and paste a quick survey to everyone. And it would be really, really helpful for us to get your thoughts on your overall experience here at IES. We would love for you to take a minute to send us your feedback. We do take it very seriously. It's always great to have that from you guys. And I will also go ahead and post all of our other links. As we're closing out, this is the last hour of the day. So we will be doing something a little bit different to end out the day here. So for you animal lovers out there, you can join our friends at Goat to Meeting for a virtual tour of Sweet Farm Sanctuary to meet the rescue goats and other animals under their care. Or if you'd prefer to stretch your mind, you can test your knowledge with our virtual Teams trivia. These events will begin at 5 p.m. Eastern time. And you can view the chat, like I said, with those event meeting room links or access to the conference website for a complete list of tomorrow's concurrent sessions and their descriptions. IES 2022 will continue tomorrow at 10 a.m. Eastern time with a virtual tour of the Theban Desert. And if you'd like to get an early start, join us for a stretch during our 9:30 a.m. chair yoga session. There are more details, and the full Friday schedule can be found on that schedule or on that conference website. While accessing the conference website, don't forget to swing by the exhibit hall to say hello to the Hawks team. And there you can view a quick 5-minute demonstration, and you'll be entered to win the hourly giveaway, your choice of a 6-month subscription to Audible, 1-year subscription to Disney Plus, or a $100 Amazon gift card, which are all exciting to me. And thanks again to all of our presenters and all of our attendees for joining day 1 of IES. We appreciate you guys so much. And we hope to see you guys at some of our next events over the next day. So with that, we can end this session here. Thank you guys so much for your great presentation. And hopefully we'll see you guys tomorrow for some of our other sessions later on. So with that, we'll close out this room. You guys head on to trivia or to go see the goats and the animals, which is all fun. And we will see you tomorrow.